I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Zoning Board of Adjustment for the City of Ames for, got to think right, January 8th, 2025. The Zoning Board of Adjustment is a quasi-judicial board created by the City of Ames. The board's purpose is to decide on applications for special use permits, exceptions, and variances to the zoning ordinance, applications for conditional use permits in the floodplain, requests for reasonable accommodations because of a disability, and appeals of decisions of the zoning enforcement officer. As a city of the board, we welcome all testimony. We make our decisions based on the facts and evidence as allowed under city code and presented in open meeting. Testimony before the board must be given under oath or affirmation. If the proceedings become lengthy, we may ask that testimony be focused on new facts or evidence not already presented. We ask that you come to the microphone if you wish to speak. It's right up here so that your testimony will be audible and may be recorded. Before speaking, you need to fill out an orange information card and hand it to the recording secretary right up here, Natalie. When you are testifying, please address your remarks to the board. We also ask that proceedings be orderly. The Zoning Board of Adjustment is an independent volunteer board of citizens. We are not part of the city administration. We are served in our efforts this evening by Jane Chang, Assistant City Attorney, Kelly Diekman, Planning and Housing Director, Ray Anderson, who's a city planner, and Natalie Rickmeyer, Recording Secretary. The order of proceedings for each application will be as follows. First, an oral statement summarizing the issues and procedural steps will be presented by the staff. Second, testimony and evidence will be presented by the applicant. Third, testimony may be heard from any members of the audience who wish to speak in support or in opposition to the appeal. Next, the board will give the applicant and the city staff an opportunity to present concluding summaries and arguments. And finally, the board will discuss the issues and evidence and come to a decision. On the agenda tonight, the first item on the agenda is the approval of the meeting of the minutes from December 11th, 2024. Do I have a motion from the board to approve the minutes from December 11th, 2024?
I'll make a motion.
Motion by Whitehouse. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
All right, we have a second motion on the floor. All those in favor of approving the minutes from December 11th indicate by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Okay, the meeting of the minutes from December 11th, 2024 are approved. The next item on the agenda is appeal from a decision of the zoning enforcement officer for the Historic Preservation Commission that the Historic Preservation Commission does not have a role for advising the City Council on the proposed text amendment for uses within the OSCF or FC Single Family Conservation Overlay District. So do we have a report? First item is a report from the staff.
Yes, so as an appeal of a decision of staff, it comes before the board to decide if there was an error by staff. So tonight we're not reviewing the intent and the potential of interpretations another way. The intent here is to look at whether there's an error by staff in the interpretation. And tonight, what I have up on the screen, the main focus seems to be a little loud tonight. Section 2, which is the notice section on the screen, is the first appeal that we're talking about tonight from David Carter. So the section that is at question was my decision that a proposed zoning text amendment that applies to the single family conservation overlay district that also would cover a subgroup of properties that are in the historic overlay did not need to go before the Historic Preservation Commission before it was reviewed by the Planning and Zoning Commission and then eventually by the City Council. The reason for this interpretation by myself was focused on the word effect. And the word effect is defined as something that would cause a change. And as I looked at what the zoning text amendment would mean, which was an allowance for another use to be permitted in the single family conservation overlay district, it did not change any development standards. I did not find that it would affect an historic resource or designated landmark within that district. And as I looked at the authority of the Historic Preservation Commission, while it has in its powers and duties review zoning amendments, again with the word affecting historic resources, I did not find that adding a use of a general nature would directly impact or affect something within the historic district. And then as I looked back at precedent of how this has been treated, I did not find examples of us taking general ordinances to the Historic Preservation Commission that did not have a direct effect on standards related to historic resources. So for example, in the last 10 years, we've had changes to front yard parking requirements. We've had changes to allow uses of vacation lodging within the single family conservation overlay. We've had changes to how non-conforming structures can be rebuilt. We've had changes to setback encroachments and allowances. So some of those things even have some, so they have general applicability, and we did not take them to the Historic Preservation Commission. So for me, the decision was that we have not had a history of doing that. I did not believe the proposed use amendment would affect a designated historic district, and determined that it was not required to have that step of review. Since making that determination, I did look back at the ordinance that you see referenced as being amended on 10/10 of 2000. So there was a slight change in language that I also think is pertinent to our conversation. So the word affect was added, it replaced a word on 10/10/2000. When we adopted our current zoning ordinance in May of 2000, it was worded slightly differently. It used the word respecting properties, which would be a more far-reaching term because it would include all properties then within the overlay. And in October, it was modified to say affect. Unfortunately, the council action form for that change, it was a list. There was a number of changes happening in that update because the code had just been updated. It didn't provide great depth to that. It just said that the modification of language was to address the intent of the standard. So they didn't explain it any more depth. But to me, the change from respecting to affect definitely emphasizes affect should be the word that I'm looking at to interpret this section. And that's all I have to present on my decision.
Questions for staff?
In the report, I might have read it wrong, but did it say that the city attorney had a contrary opinion about this ordinance, or did I misread that?
It wasn't contrary. They had, so the way we gave you a little bit of the timeline to try and understand, because out of the blue, you might not understand why this was happening. As we're reviewing the zoning ordinance amendment or the text amendment, there was a request to council for a decision about this issue and some other things. And the council asked for an opinion from the city attorney. Their opinion concurred that it was not a necessary step, reflecting what I had voiced at a meeting earlier. Eventually, we wrote this in November as an official written determination, which triggered the appeal option for that. So the city attorney's opinion was a communication to the council. It was not a decision of the planning director on the meaning of the zoning ordinance.
And in your opinion, what would be a change that would affect the proposed or designated landmarks and historic districts? Would it be like a more visible structural change?
I think if you're changing the standards within, well, this chapter 31 is what all the standards exist for historic review. Clearly, if any of those things were being changed, that would go before them. If there were, it's a little bit hard because we've had quite a variety of things that have not gone because of their general applicability. So to me, it had to be more narrow and affect something that was under the direct review of the board. And there are two parts to this. We're only talking about the zoning ordinance amendment part. It also talks about zoning applications that would go to the zoning board of adjustment. So those would be a little more clear if they have alterations to them or you're changing a property, then that would have a zoning board of adjustment review, then you would have an HPC review. So it's covering two kind of totally different things in my opinion, because the planning commission almost always only reviews text amendments, especially within the single family conservation overlay. There's some oddities about how apartment site plans are reviewed, but that's really the only thing that could be reviewed that is not an ordinance amendment by the Planning and Zoning Commission. But then the ZBA could deal with variances, they could deal with special use permits, you could deal with exceptions for a property. So those would be much clearer things where you would say, well, that's affecting a structure, that's an historic resource. This would likely lead you to refer it to HPC before it came to ZBA.
And just for clarification, the single family conservation overlay district is larger than the historic preservation overlay, so that they're on top of each other, or the historic overlay is actually on top of
It's within the
or
boundaries.
within the
of this.
boundaries
Yep.
of the single family. So
Yes.
they have to comply with both the requirements for the single family conservation, and then if it's in the historic district, the historic preservation overlay.
Yes.
They have to comply with both.
So this overlay language, when you get to 3 is, so 2 is unique, and it's telling us you must provide notice to the board to give consideration. But 3 is the one that directs you to how the standards and the permitting actually work.
And when you're looking at obviously the single family conservation overlay, the provisions of the historic preservation overlay have no effect on that.
Can you restate that?
So when you look at the requirements on the single family conservation overlay for that zoning, the requirements for that zoning, those are not affected by the
So-
historic preservation overlay. They can be changed outside of the historic preservation.
Yeah, right,
Overlay
correct. So
requirement.
chapter 31 does not address any specific zoning district. It deals with the type of historic resources and the types of alterations. So the single family conservation overlay lists what uses are allowed in general for that area. Just like normally you have a base zone that says you can have a house or an apartment or a commercial building. In this case, the single family overlay narrows that down. And then it has its own design standards, which then say also that if they were to, you must meet both the single family overlay standards as well as chapter 31 standards. It does say that in the overlay.
Now, these are hard to kind of parse because some of the issues are interrelated as I look at it with the other appeal. So when you say that the historic preservation overlay does not deal with uses, why then do you have to get a certificate of appropriateness for an industrial, commercial business, home industry, or occupational parking? Because that
So
definitely indicates it has at least something to say about use.
It doesn't, because it's about a physical improvement on the property of creating parking. It's not about whether there's a use on the property. So no change of use has ever gone to HPC. That's the next appeal. That's not what this first one is about.
Right, but I'm saying when you said, okay, this section for single family conservation doesn't have anything to do with use, I understand that, but in effect, there is a provision in the historic preservation overlay that does in part address use.
It doesn't, I don't believe it does at all. What it says in the next section 3 is that in simple terms, it says, even though you're a permitted use in a regular zoning district and don't need a permit for things, and I'll give you a great example. In most of the city, you don't need a fence permit. In the historic district, chapter 31 requires a fence permit. So this overlay in number 3 is saying, even though you may not need a permit anywhere else, the overlay permitting standards will apply. And then the second part is, in addition, that list of uses in relation to parking also needs a permit. It doesn't say the change of use needs that. It just says the parking needs a permit, which would make sense because it's going to be an alteration to a site, right? You're going to build a parking lot. You can see how that might affect an historic resource and a normal, in the Old Town Historic District anyways, those uses aren't permitted. So you're not going to see that. and they don't have standards for them. But we do have some other OH overlays. So there's not just the Old Town Historic District, there's the Adams property in North Ames, and then you have the Martin House on Lincoln Way. Well, the Martin House base zone is HOC. So we don't have, so you could see commercial parking or another type of use that's allowed in that HOC zoning district have parking alterations, and someone would want that to go to HPC to see how it affects the context of the historic resource that's on that site. So again, it's not all about Old Town. That's where this one is generated from, but these standards apply beyond Old Town.
Just for clarification, then, what is the base zone? I'm generally assuming for single family conservation overlay is just residential. Is that the base, or what is
It's medium density residential.
medium density? Okay.
I believe all the if it's not all, it's like 99% of them are RM.
Okay, any additional questions for staff at this time?
I have another question. Is there any precedent of what I guess would consider non-activities, physical activities that you're kind of defining here going in front of the HPC prior to this?
I am not aware of HOC reviewing any site-specific change that is not defined in Chapter 31 as needing a certificate of appropriateness. At times, they have had references where they review an ordinance, or council may add, please get the opinion of the HPC about something that's happening. So an example that HPC did review an ordinance is when we added adaptive reuse option for the Roosevelt School. It wasn't an allowed thing to be apartments at that point in time. So the city created a process for that and added HPC into that with standards. That ordinance went to HPC so they could concur with the standards and expectations of what would happen for an adaptive reuse project of an historic building. So that's an example where it went to HPC, and that was at the direction of council to make sure the standards that were being created were appropriate in the eyes of the HPC. So I don't know that I completely answered your question about other things that may have gone. I'm not familiar with other uses or other things that could have gone previously.
So then, to just clarify that, then the adaptive reuse was actual physical changes, not just the internal use.
Well, the first part was an ordinance to create the process, and then they came back through the process to get a permit. So what I was referencing was the ordinance, and HPC reviewed that ordinance to agree with the standards and expectations of that. And then they do have if you are an adaptive reuse permit, the code does actually direct you to HPC for those types of things too. And the other example I had in the report was that when last year, when we created accessory dwelling units across the city, we did go to Historic Preservation Commission for that, and we did have edits to Chapter 31 as a result of the discussion about allowing accessory dwelling units citywide and how it related to the historic district standards. So that resulted in changes to Chapter 31, and we took that before them.
But like my last question, that was an issue of altering something on physical, not it included use, but it also included a physical alteration.
It had, yeah. So the use wasn't really a question because we had to allow for the use, but we had standards about how the use could be placed on a site. So we went to the commission and discussed this use is to be permitted. How does it fit the historic district standards that would be there? And did they have concerns about whether certain types of features should be permitted or not? And that's where we ended up with changes into Chapter 31 to clarify how ADUs would get addressed. within a future certificate of appropriateness.
Okay, any additional questions? All right, at this time, if the applicant like to approach, may address the board.
Thank you. Thank you. David Carter, 7 Mountain Douglas.
Okay, Mr. Carter, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes.
All right, thank you, sir. You may go ahead.
So we tend to run far afield. This is a complicated relationship. The appeal deals specifically with 2 sections in the municipal code. One is section 291102 here in the ordinance. The other one that really only, the main one with direct relevance is in the historic preservation chapter, and it's under the powers and duties, 31-6, number 7. So specifically, the appeal, 291102, there's 280 words in there, 3 paragraphs. It's pretty simple. It's pretty direct, and it's an overlay zone, but all it does is state its purpose and give direction for process. And pretty plain language, procedures established to ensure the Preservation Commission is specifically notified of all applications before the Planning and Zoning Commission or the ZBA, respecting property within or proximate to the local historic districts. So in the instance we had earlier with the proposed zoning text amendment, that applied. Second part is notice, and it's labeled notice because that's really the purpose of the whole overlay, is to give notice to the Preservation Commission and theoretically to the residents in the district of proposed changes. And I would argue that the word effect is much more specific than the word respecting. And the history of this, and I was there, this was part of the overhaul of the entire zoning ordinance that occurred along with a revision of the land use plan in the 90s. It took 7 or 8 years, but this is put in here specifically to ensure that zoning changes and changes of use are noticed to the Preservation Commission. The Preservation Commission can make a recommendation. They can make no recommendation, but they need to, this is specifically to ensure that they get consideration by the Preservation Commission as the initial process when they affect an historic district. And I guess it would be hard to argue that if a zoning amendment applies to a property in the historic district, the Old Town Historic District, that it does not affect that property. It certainly does. And there's another item on your agenda that deals with number 3 here. We can discuss the implications of that on the next item. I guess it's fairly straightforward to me. I think anybody else that reads this. There's a number of other people I know here that can speak to this and provide a little more insight. Do you have any questions for me at this time?
So you're considering the language in here that when it says proposed zoning ordinance amendments, that it would include any amendments to the zoning ordinance, even those outside of chapter 31 or section 31.
State that again.
So it would, you say any amendments to zoning ordinances includes
That affect,
even outside of chapter 31, the
Well-
historic requirements.
I think there's many, well, there are no amendments to the zoning ordinance that affect chapter 31 because chapter 31 is not a zoning ordinance. The zoning ordinance is chapter 29. Chapter 31 is a historic preservation ordinance. You understand the difference? An historic preservation district is not a zone. Zones are defined in chapter 29. Historic districts are defined in chapter 31, which is historic preservation. The OH Historic Preservation Overlay is not a historic district. It is an overlay. It is a zone. It has the same properties at this time as the Old Town Historic Preservation District, but they are two different things. So this overlay, which I am appealing the decision on, it applies to zoning amendments that affect the historic district. You understand? It does not apply as has been misstated in reports, staff reports and city attorney memos. It does not apply, this does not apply to the historic preservation overlay. It applies to zoning amendments that affect the historic district, which is a set of properties. The Old Town Historic District is a geographic area, set of properties defined on the map.
But wouldn't you agree that the historic district is
The same properties as the historic overlay. That
so
doesn't
is-
have to be.
That is chapter 31 then.
No, the historic preservation overlay is not chapter 31. It is chapter 29. The historic district is defined by chapter 31.
But when you look at section 291102, the purpose of it is to establish the preservation overlay, which is section 31. It clearly says that.
No. It is to recognize the establishment of the historic district in section 31. It is not to establish the historic district. It is to recognize that the historic district is there. And then to go further, it is to promote the public interest in having full and informed participation in the hearing of zoning applications potentially affecting the city's historic resources. Those are in the historic district.
So you're.
They
what you're
could be
saying,
in
though-
other ones
Okay,
too.
so I'm just trying to clarify your position. So you're saying though that then any amendment to any property that would be considered
That is correct.
designated landmark, a historical district, even if it's not in the historical preservation overlay, should be brought to the.
No. I'm saying if it's in the historic preservation overlay and is in a historic district, which at this time, those are the same properties, this applies. You could read it, your contention, you could read it more liberally, but that was not my appeal. My appeal was that this applies, certainly it says, to historic districts And in this case, the historic district and the historic overlay are the same properties. You can't argue that. They are not. And therefore, this applies to all applications before the Planning and Zoning Commission or the ZBA respecting property in the Old Town Historic District.
Any other questions for the applicant?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Mr. Carter, thanks for your testimony and thanks for your time. I'm looking at your document. It says report and rebuttal, has some red text in it.
Yes,
And it says that the HPC responsibilities are defined in the standards of the review authority are not limited to section 31.6.5, external alterations and new construction.
there's 14 powers and duties that listed there.
So,
And- Okay,
just let me finish my question. So I'm
Yep.
going to ask you the same question that I asked the staff. Is there precedent for the HPC taking on something that, an issue that it was not external alterations and new construction, as you state there?
well, I know of one. In 1993, I petitioned to change the zoning in the historic preservation, Old Town Historic Preservation District. And I went to the Historic Preservation Commission as the first step in that process.
So, like you petitioned to change,
I petitioned to downzone
okay,
in 1993 the area that ultimately became the CEFCOD.
okay. And that went to the Historic Preservation Commission.
First.
Right, okay.
Yep. Any other questions? I'd like Sharon Worth to visit with you. She has a history with the historic preservation, the Old Town Historic District, Historic Preservation Commission, 16 years on the city council. I think she could give you a little insight and background as to how this has evolved.
Okay, we'll have opportunity for the public to provide
Mhm.
testimony if they wish.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Carter.
Mhm.
All right. If any members of the audience who wish to speak in support or opposition to the appeal would like to approach, just a reminder that this needs to be new facts or evidence. If you're voicing support, we appreciate that, and you can do that. But if we begin to have repeated arguments, I guess, I'll reserve the right to ask you to present new facts or evidence that have not already been presented. So when you come, just remember you need to fill out a card so that we have information, and then please identify yourself, and then I'll swear you in.
I'll fill out the card and give it to you after. I'll testify.
Okay.
It's moving. Ann Kinsel, 720 Duff.
Okay, and do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you for hearing this appeal this evening. I think there are two rules of statutory construction at play here. The first is in Chapter 31, Historic Preservation. The preamble or purpose speaks generally to the need to promote the educational, cultural, and economic welfare of the public of the city by preserving and protecting historic structures, sites, neighborhoods, which serve as visible reminders of the history and cultural heritage of the city, state, and nation. Moving down to the last sentence, because you can review this yourselves, it is the purpose of the chapter to foster civic pride and enhance the attractiveness of the community to residents, potential residents, and visitors. And earlier, this appeal really focuses on the word effect. And there's always a need to read statutes in concert, okay? So Section 31.1 provides us with why we have a historic preservation district in the city of Ames. Moving to Section 29 and the word effect, a further rule of statutory construction is that we are required in the law to use the plain meaning of words as we interpret laws and ordinances. And I think that the plain meaning of the word effect is what we know it to be. The steps that would be taken in this case would affect the district. It would affect the economy potentially. It would affect the stabilization and improvements of property values in the district. And it also requires in Section 31 that new developments must be harmonious with the intent of the existing historic buildings and structures. And I think in reading these two statutes in the way that the law requires us to, harmoniously, to reconcile them, there's no other way to interpret this but that the word effect in its plain meaning in Chapter 29 would require that this appeal be granted. So thank you for your time, and I'll fill out your card and give it to you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Sharon Worth of 921 9th Street and a former resident of the Old Town neighborhood.
Sharon, before you get too far,
Sorry.
do you affirm or swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. I'd like to share a bit about my background with you. My husband and I are long-term urban core residents, moving into Old Town as a young married couple in the 70s. Don't think about age here. Staying to start and raise our family there. 10 years ago, we moved into the Roosevelt condominiums. My journey along the way to today has included being a neighborhood advocate, an historic preservation advocate, restoring a historic home, spending 16 years on the Ames City Council, serving as a Historic Preservation Commission member, teaching and coordinating a lab at Iowa State for 16 years, and numerous other community volunteer activities. I chaired the volunteer citizen efforts to add a historic preservation chapter to the Ames City Code and to establish the Old Town Historic District, working with the then planning director, other city staff members, citizen volunteers, and city council members. This extensive involvement with historic preservation and public service is the foundation for my comments tonight. Running a city and developing an attractive, diverse, and healthy community is much like working on a puzzle. You must fit the many different pieces together to achieve a satisfactory result. The big difference is that with a community, you never really have a finished product, and your actions directly affect the lives of citizens. A major part of community is its governance. In Ames, governance includes many pieces. For a positive outcome, the many pieces must be integrated and work together. This includes the many departments, the city code, city boards and commissions, and elected officials. How these pieces work together or not affect the lives of individual citizens and the community as a whole. This commission is an important piece of those many parts. So thank you for serving on the ZBA. Citizen involvement is certainly critical to the well-being of our community. Having been involved early on with historic preservation in the Ames community, I can say without reservation that the intention was for historic preservation and for the Historic Preservation Commission to be a partner in city planning. This is quite clearly stated in chapters 29 and 31, both referencing the hearing of zoning applications potentially affecting the city's historic resources. I won't quote the language since you've heard that already from the appellant and the city staff. Historic preservation and the HPC are not only about reviewing and issuing a certificate of appropriateness. The community's historic resources are affected by more than the exterior of a structure. And that is why the code lists other duties as well. With all due respect to the parties of this appeal, good city planning looks at other pertinent factors as clearly listed in the Ames Code in both chapters 29 and 31. To pull out one duty and disregard the others is to cut off the arms and legs of historic preservation and will affect the community as a whole in a negative way. Much like the human body, all the pieces and parts are connected here, and that connection affects the whole in many ways. An attractive, diverse community only results when the many parts are integrated and working together. Review by the Historic Preservation Commission enhances government transparency and integration, important core values. Citizens need to know that their city government will follow established and approved rules and provide a stable base for their environment and investment. This is true for residential as well as commercial investments. Without this stable base, citizen involvement, investment, and the city will wither. Transparency, integration, and collaboration are key values for success in our community. I urge you to endorse these values and support both parts of the appeal on tonight's agenda. I appreciate the opportunity to provide some input tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions? All right, thank you, Sharon.
Good evening. Shelley Orngard, 928 Burnett.
Shelley, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I certainly do.
Thank you.
I do. I am honored and delighted to be able to be here this evening following on the comments of people I have a great deal of respect for. I've lived in the Old Town neighborhood for 27 years, and it is because of the work that they achieved that we do have this wonderful and somewhat fragile, meaning it could easily be destroyed neighborhood, but we still do have it. So we're here because several decisions made by the planning director limited the input of the Ames Historic Preservation Commission and Old Town and single family overlay residents, and a proposed zoning amendment went to the Ames City Council before it should have. If all zoning decisions were made by planning directors without input from neighborhood community members, and of course that isn't the way it was intended to be, but if that were the way, then Ames wouldn't have a historic district. Community members had a huge role, not just being on a committee and establishing the code, but, and I think you're probably well aware of the Ames Historic Overlay was established when many historic homes were demolished to make way for apartment buildings and businesses. This demolition wasn't part of a grand plan by the Ames Planning Department, but rather a collection of decisions that bit by bit eroded the character of Ames' original residential neighborhood. As you know, the residents of that neighborhood began to take action and eventually were able to see the establishment of the historic district and overlay. Looking back, most of us believe that Ames is a better town because of the protections set forward and codified in Section 31, the Ames Municipal Code, and Section 29. But time passes and often the lessons of history fade, and so at this juncture it is good to refresh our memories about the purpose and powers and duties of the Ames Historic Preservation Commission. Because I think what's being stated is that this zoning amendment should have gone in front of the Historic Preservation Commission in advance of the City Council. Previous commenters have talked about the purpose of the Historic Preservation Commission being to promote the educational, cultural, and economic welfare of the public, of the city, and so on. But I also want to restate in section 31.6 the powers and duties of the Historic Preservation Commission include number 7, very clearly stated, to review proposed zoning amendments that affect proposed or designated landmarks and historic districts. What we're looking at today is a reading of the planning director that significantly limits the stated and encoded powers of the Historic Preservation Commission to refer only to alterations to property and parking spaces. But a fair reading of the municipal code demonstrates that while oversight of alterations and parking spaces in the historic district is part of the duties of the Historic Preservation Commission, it is not the whole of its powers and duties. Democracy can be a messy and inconvenient thing for administrators, but the thing that we want to keep in mind is that we're all better off when the real reason a zoning decision is made is for the benefit of the community and not for the benefit or efficiency of or the interests of one applicant. I hope today the Zoning Board of Adjustment stands with the Old Town community and reaffirms the duties and powers of the Historic Preservation Commission by deciding in favor of the appellant, David Carter. Thank you.
Good evening. Go ahead with your
Okay.
name and then an address, and then we'll swear you.
Hi, I'm Kate Gregory. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I live at 803 Kellogg.
Kate, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'm a member of the Old Town Neighborhood Association Board. I'm also a member of the Historic Preservation Commission. I'm on the HPC because the city code requires a member of the Old Town Neighborhood Association Board to serve on the HPC. It seems unlikely to me that the city code would create an HPC and require a member of the Old Town Neighborhood Association Board to sit on it if they didn't want or expect the HPC to be involved in issues that impact the historic district. And changes in the historic district zoning clearly impact the historic district. I appreciate the comments that were made about using clear language. And to me, if something impacts the zoning of my house, it impacts me, and it's important. By arguing that the HPC doesn't need to be involved in zoning changes related to the historic district, the city is not allowing the HPC to fill the role the city itself directed the HPC to do. As others have noted, organizations like the HPC and the ZBA enhance transparency and integration and allow the public to participate in government. Denying the HPC the chance due to the job they were established to do doesn't make any sense. Worse, it sends a bad message to the public about the city's desire for public involvement, the city's respect for people and their communities, and the city's commitment to follow its own laws. The ZBA was created to help the city ensure that it follows its laws. I hope you will support the appeals and endorse the role of the HPC in future decision-makings that impact the historic district. I appreciate your consideration on this issue and your service on the ZBA. Thank you.
My name is Kate Simon. I'm the attorney for David Carter. I don't know if you want me to get a slip or not, but I just wanted to make some closing remarks. I don't believe anybody else would like to speak unless. Okay. Okay.
She'd like to make closing remarks until they speak.
She's representing the applicant, so I guess I'm kind of curious how you want to put that into the process since the applicant
I think-
spoke already.
I think it'd be best at this point, Kate, if you went at the end, because we always give the applicant another chance to address the board. So I think
Perfect.
that would be appropriate if you went then.
And I'll fill out a sheet.
All right, thank you. So if there's anyone else who wishes to address the board.
Good evening. My name is Frank Fielmeyer, 612 Kellogg.
Mr. Fieldmeyer, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir.
I am here representing Oscar Romero Trust, and commonly known as Romero House. And I just want to fill you in on the fact that Oscar Romero Trust is a qualified tax-exempt charitable organization that owns property on Clark Avenue, and did make the request to the city to allow a social service use at one of their properties. My client, Romero Trust, has made no application to alter any structure. They have only asked for the ability to conduct a social service. And so I'm addressing you because Romero House is the real party in interest here. We are here to support, and we agree with the city planning director's decision and the city attorney's interpretation of the code. This case is 100% about whether you, sitting here as an appellate court, basically, the judges in this legal dispute over the meaning of a part of the ordinance, believe that the planning director interpreted the city code correctly. Your decision can and should give no weight at all to whether you think the underlying zoning ordinance use that Romero Trust wants to put into effect is good or bad, or whether any of the appellant's position or any of his supporters don't like the use or don't think that it's appropriate. As I understand the structure of what will happen if this zoning ordinance is passed, is that there will be other opportunities for the appellants to take a bite at that apple. Your only decision is about whether the planning director's legal interpretation of the zoning code he deals with every day is correct. If you favor the appellant, your decision is effectively that the city's full-time planning director and the city attorney do not understand their own code. If you find that in favor of the appellant, you're also slapping the city council for every other ordinance that it has passed that dealt with the base RM zone. I count at least 9. And any other zoning ordinance that has modified the definitions and uses that are used throughout the city code. And Mr. Dykeman has given you a number of those examples. There's not a single word in any ordinance giving the HPC power over uses. Even section 291102 only requires HPC's certificate for changes to structures and for parking for various specific uses. And I think that's been gone over in great detail. There's not a single word in the proposed text amendment to the overlay that changes anything in the powers and duties of the HPC. I find myself agreeing with some of the comments made here today. And I think it's important that you look at section 31.1 of the municipal code. And in that purpose, it states, as you've already heard, the purpose of this chapter is to promote the educational, cultural, and economic welfare of the public of the city by preserving and protecting historic structures, sites, and neighborhoods. which serve as visible reminders of the history and cultural heritage, and so forth. The purpose, power, procedures, certificate of appropriateness, and everything else about Chapter 31 deals with the structures. The Chapter 29 zoning code references to the HPC are to the structures. You cannot read anything else in Chapter 31 of the municipal code without first saying to yourself, provided it addresses preserving and protecting historic structures. So if you scroll down to the powers and duties of the HPC in section 31.6, you need to start with, provided it addresses and preserving and protecting historic structures, the commission shall have the following powers and duties. You need to have that in your head as you read that section. That's what makes 29.11.02.2 make sense. If it affects the structure, HPC has a role. With all respect to the appellant, trying to portray the powers and duties of all the notices due HPC as clear and unambiguous in their favor completely and conveniently ignores the introduction that you must read as part of the code, provided it addresses and preserving and protecting historic structures. The last thing I want to leave you with is I want to caution you against entertaining what I think would be an intellectually dishonest argument that there is no harm in delay. You cannot split that baby here. You cannot rationalize giving the appellant his way by saying it is no big deal to delay for any period of time because there is always a cost. I told you about one cost, and that's casting doubt on a host of zoning ordinances, casting doubt on the planning director's decisions. The other cost is real, and it is to Romero House. And I thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to address them.
Have any questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman.
Thank you.
Hello, my voice. I'm David Thielen, the Executive Director of the Romero House.
Okay.
I live at,
Mr. Thielen, do you swear to affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Go ahead and give your address,
I
sorry.
live at 3974 North Dakota Avenue here in Ames. And I don't want to spend a lot of time here. I just want to state that as a taxpayer of this city, I put my trust in city government and in governance. I put my trust in somebody that's been in this position for over 10 years, the planning director, and somebody that's been making legal decisions for the city for well over 10 years, the city attorney. The city attorney left a very compelling legal opinion that agreed with the planning director. There'd be a massive loss of confidence in the city if we're going to overturn the city attorney and the city director of planning and housing. I'm not just saying that for me, I'm saying it for the entire city. We have a great city council, a great ZBA, great boards. HPC is great. We're not talking about structures here, we're talking about use. So I plead and ask and request that we take into consideration the leaders of the city whose job is to read the ordinance, interpret the ordinance, and act upon it. And they both made their legal opinions and their determination letters very clear. Thank you.
process question. Are you allowing rebuttal statements by whom?
The applicant gets an opportunity to address the
Just
board
the
again.
applicant
Yes,
or other members of the
Just the
public?
applicant.
Thank you.
Any other members of the public wish to address the board? You get another bite, but it needs to be short.
Very short.
Yes.
Ann Kinzel, 720 Duff Avenue, and I do swear to tell the truth again. I think that the performance of the city attorney and the planning director are not at what is at issue in this appeal, and they are not part of what you should be considering. It's not your role to sit as evaluators of what they have done, but to hear the facts that this appeal is based on. Thank you.
With that, this time, if the applicant would like to address the board again, we'll have opportunity. Go ahead and identify yourself and we'll swear you in.
Kate Simon, attorney for the applicant.
Okay, and Kate, do you swear to or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to try to walk this back as clearly as I can to address the specific question that's in front of you all right now. So with regard, I think everyone did a great job addressing that both chapters 29 and 31 are relevant, and that with regards to the proposed text amendment for a single family overlay district, because this overlaps, we can't just look at it without addressing the HPC. So section 29.1507 addresses zoning text amendments, and it specifically states that those should be read to mean that the council on its own or with the planning and zoning recommendation change the regulation without considering the section 29 as a whole is improper. So all of section 29 has to be considered. Within section 29, there are multiple areas that state that the Historic Preservation Commission shall review and consider such applications for any zoning amendments. Now, if we review the city attorney's recommendation, he specifically addresses this as a zoning amendment or a zoning change. So that in and of itself is concerning to me. It specifically also states in section 29 that any proposed zoning ordinance amendments, again, shall be considered by the HPC, and that they should be specifically notified. To my understanding, they were not specifically notified of anything. I believe just the general public was notified. So there's multiple issues, multiple layers here. And when you're considering section 29 as a whole, which you must do, those were not considered. And it specifically also states under section 29.1503, when we're addressing the issue of a special use permit here, that I think is encompassing that the code requires more steps and more precautions rather than less. So completely skipping over addressing the HPC would be less steps, which is in violation of that section relevant here. And from my point of view as an attorney, when these get appealed further and go to the district court, I think the district courts definitely look at the legislature as a whole, right? They look at the purpose of why these codes were enacted and what the intent behind them was, which the purpose is specifically laid out. It's beyond just the aesthetic of the buildings, right? The HPC has the ability to review above and beyond that, including zoning, and that's specifically laid out, and that they shall review zoning issues. So, I think that's an issue here. If we are turning, briefly to chapter 31, which I can get into more on the next question, but the word shall is also used in that, which many members of the public have articulated very well that those proposed zoning amendments shall be reviewed by the HPC. So I'll get into that further next, but I appreciate your time.
Any questions, or do you want to take questions and all?
If anyone has questions, I'm happy to stay. Thank you.
All right. Staff also has the opportunity to provide a concluding summary or argument based on and everything that's been presented.
Yeah, just a short response. Again, I think this whole thing pivots on the word effect. No one is diminishing the powers and duties of HPC. The word effect is used both in the purpose statement, in the notice statement, in the powers and duties of HPC. So to me, effect has to be interpreted because I think the definition of it is in response to change. And we don't see a change of use affecting the historic resources. So that is why this ordinance did not go before them. The discussions of other types of future permits, things that haven't been applied for, not really relevant to the discussion tonight because it's specifically about the process applied to the one zoning text amendment to create an allowable use within the single family conservation overlay district. And if there's any other questions about my decision making or any other sections of the code, I'm happy to answer those.
When we look at section 31.6 and the powers and duties, when it gets to number 7, it says to review proposed zoning amendments that affect proposed or designated landmarks in historic districts. How then are you interpreting that when it just says zoning amendments?
I mean, you could, since it doesn't say, this one says zoning ordinance amendments, which could be the map itself. So designation of an OH overlay, that's a map amendment. It's an amendment to the ordinance, the way the whole chapter 29 is structured. But we've also considered text amendments. At this point, we're considering text amendments, zoning ordinance amendments as well. So I would give deference that 7 is either a map amendment or a text amendment, but I still think the word effect would have the same meaning as in this section here in chapter 29.
So it's 31.67 just confined to just section 31 then?
Yes. Right. So this section, HPC only has a role as defined within chapter 31. Chapter 29 is linking their role to zoning decisions of certain types. This brings that advisory capacity in. And then as we know in section 3, it gives them the actual authority over certain types of permits. So the purpose of this for me, from a zoning perspective, we have the overlay. So you can notify the public someone's property is subject to the Historic Preservation Commission, to the Historic Preservation Ordinance of chapter 31. You don't see standards here because they're all embodied in that chapter 31.
Any other questions?
I have a question. So a text amendment to the zoning code within this historic district could be reviewed by the HPC, but this specific text change, in your opinion, doesn't affect the district in the way that this would prescribe a...
Correct. That's what I'm saying is the use does not affect an historic resource.
That social services use?
Correct.
Okay.
Because you can't presuppose there's effects to the exterior of the building or structure. Again, everything's about structures, not uses within the overlay. So to me, when you're just talking about general uses, that does not have does not affect the structures within the district. It may, those are future permits, future decisions to be made, but at this point in time, just a general use allowance, I can't conclude it will affect the historic resource.
To clarify, if in the future, the property owner wished to make a structural change, there's further opportunities for Historic Preservation Commission to review those?
If it's If it is an historic resource, so in section 3 up on the screen, that's what's going to dictate HPC's review of any alterations to an historic resource. So in the historic district, the majority of properties are historic resources, but not all.
Right.
So the majority of the authority of HPC is mostly about existing resources. If you were to construct a new building, there are standards for that. But if you're just a non-contributing property and you're altering that, it isn't necessarily subject to review.
Is the property a contributing property?
Remember, the ordinance is not for one property. So there's
Right.
350 properties in the single family overlay. Do you remember how many in the historic district off here? 150. So about 150 are in the historic district, and then the majority are contributing resources. So the way again, we're not reviewing the merits of the ordinance, but it applies to more than one property.
Right.
Question under 291102 subsection 2, amendments that are to be considered. Says that those are amendments prior to consideration by the ZBA and by the Planning and Zoning Commission. Doesn't mention anything about the city council.
So the commission, in terms of process, the commission must review a proposed zoning text amendment or map amendment before the council can consider it.
I assume that was part of the procedure, but I just want to make sure that.
Correct. So we followed the zoning amendment process with notice for the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting and for the city council meeting. And we also provide mail notice to every property owner in the area before the council meeting.
And that would have been all the people that are in the, you got to get the right designation right, the single family conservation overlay. Those
Yeah, so we sent
individuals.
roughly 350 property owner notices out, which would included everybody in the overlay as well.
And that would include everybody in the historic preservation overlay also.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, just briefly, sir. Go ahead and approach. Please come to the mic.
Promise to tell the truth.
Yeah,
Dave
yeah,
Carter,
you've already
709 Douglas.
Yeah.
I believe, I admit, I sometimes mistaken. I believe there's no notice for the Planning and Zoning Commission hearing.
Again,
And I know there wasn't in this case. There's none required. The notice of a public hearing for the council, at the council stage.
Correct.
So,
and again, we're not here to talk about the amendment process, that what
Right,
actually
but
did
the
transpire.
question
It's whether
was-
HBC needed to be involved at the first step.
Right.
right, but I just wanted to correct that. There's no notice at P and Z. It's
I didn't say there was.
notice at council.
Right. I just was, yeah, I was just about the planning and zoning, how it went before them. So that's,
It did.
ma'am, we're not taking any more comments from the public. No, ma'am, sorry. I just must insist. We need to keep moving on. All right. So any other questions for staff? All right. Based on what we heard, I don't know if there needs any discussion among the board before we entertain a motion or not. Typically, I entertain a motion and get a second, then we do discussion, but I think based on everything we've heard, might need to process a little bit. Basically, as I look at it, what's before us is the determination of whether or not basically section 291102, basically subsection 2 is violated or not based on and if it was not, then the appeal should be denied. Does everybody have a copy of that available they can look at?
It's on the screen.
Any comments or discussion? Thoughts at this point in time? Do I have a motion from any member of the board?
I'll move to accept alternative 2.
Sorry, I got to pull it up here.
So I think actually your alternatives are either to affirm, to move to affirm, or move to deny. Option 2 just tells you that if you don't have 3 affirmative votes to deny, then the director's decision will stand.
So, Mr. Wiles, is your motion to deny the appeal?
Yes.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Sorry,
This is to deny the appeal, right?
Yes.
to affirm or not
Affirm.
affirm the director's decision.
So
Right.
to deny the
Okay.
appeal
Appeal
would be to affirm the planning director's
Right.
decision.
Okay.
Right.
I just wanted to make
Let's
sure
say it
that
all in
we're all
the
on
whole
the same
sentence,
page.
make sure we're all
Sorry.
clear.
Okay, so the motion on the floor from Mr. Whitehouse is that to deny the appeal and affirm the zoning enforcement officer's interpretation of the zoning ordinance.
I'll second.
Second by McDaniel. Any further discussion? Okay, roll call vote, please.
Cruz.
Recuse.
McDaniel.
What do I do? Just reaffirm?
Aye or nay?
Aye.
Schneider.
Aye.
Patton.
Aye.
Whitehouse.
Aye.
Okay, the motion has passed. The interpretation of the zoning ordinance has been affirmed and the appeal has been denied. Anyone wishing to appeal the decision of the Zoning Board of Adjustment may do so by filing a writ of certiorari in the Story County District Court within 30 days. Item number 3 on the agenda is an appeal from a decision of the zoning enforcement officer that any future requests to establish or modify a use of OH historic preservation overlay that does not otherwise require a certificate of appropriateness for alterations or new construction, as defined by Chapter 31 of the Municipal Code, does not require review by Historic Preservation Commission.
Right, so for this appeal, in some ways it's a little premature because we haven't had an application, but it was related to Mr. Carter's questions back in October. So we made a decision much along the same lines of what we just discussed, that within the scope of review, alterations of structures is the intent of review for HPC. So a change of use of a structure with no other alterations that are normally reviewed by HPC would not on its own require HPC review. And that was my decision there. You could look at this as a combination of 2 and 3. We talked about 3 a little bit. 3 does expand the actual permit authority of the HPC, which is the certificate of appropriateness, to be for, as I said before, essentially parking lots related to that list of uses. And then all of the things that are in 3110. So 3110 is the certificate of appropriateness process and the types of activities that the HPC has authority over. And when you review that, again, none of those have uses as part of the consideration. They're all about either new construction, alteration, demolition, or relocation of structures. So that was my decision in terms of, which hasn't actually been an application yet, but that was my determination that that's how I would look at that in the future. And if you want to try to square that with the notice requirement where it says before it goes to the ZBA, there's different types of permits that go to the ZBA. Some of them do include physical alterations, like we discussed, variances, exceptions, things of that nature. A special use permit may be use only. It may also have alterations that need to go to HPC. So it would depend on exactly what's proposed for a change of use on whether, and it was coming to ZBA, whether we go there before it made it to the ZBA.
Would that use also then consider, because we've talked about sometimes with special use permits or about traffic and parking and things like that, would that fall under, I mean, this includes parking, but it seems to me like that's the area of parking, not necessarily the flow or use of traffic.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if you had to take that, because there's no criteria for it for ZBA or for HPC.
Yeah.
They would not actually be reviewing the special use permit criteria per se. They would be looking at it in relation to the historic resources, I presume. We haven't done this, so I haven't had to go through that yet. So it's again, in 2, it says to consider. In chapter 31, it says review. So COAs are actually a permit where they have approval and denial authority. If it is not an alteration to a structure, they don't have approval and denial authority. So that's part of the decision-making process of if it was just a change of use, the HPC wouldn't have a permit for that and a way to approve or deny it. And how they would make a recommendation, I'm not 100% sure because we haven't gone through that before.
Any other questions about certificate of appropriateness? Okay, if the applicant wishes to address the board on this matter. Mr. Carter, you've been sworn in already, so you don't need to.
You don't have to swear again.
No, you do not, sir.
Okay. This appeal prompted by the misinterpretation of my initial letter to Kelly Diekman, actually, and his decision to include it in his written decision. I wanted to appeal this. It's not accurate. It's not correct. I didn't want to lose the opportunity to do that. The statement is not solely about parking. That is a misreading of the paragraph. It's about occupational parking. It's also about the other activities: commercial, business, home industry, and industrial. The fact that Chapter 31 does not give any criteria for the HPC to approve or deny a certificate of appropriateness does not preclude it from making some decision. And there's no prohibition in Chapter 31 against the HPC issuing certificates of appropriateness for things other than structural demolition, physical alterations. I think, actually, this whole point and the decision that the planning director included in his letter is moot, because you cannot make a determination for a future request. Those have to be made at the time of the request. And regardless of how you decide this, if I was you, I'd throw it out. his decision. Regardless of how you decide this, should this issue arise in the future, I don't think, I think in any case, there still would be grounds for an appeal by anybody who is aggrieved. So that's my position on this. Any questions?
Any question for Mr. Carter? Okay, thank you, sir.
Mhm.
If any member of the public wishes to address the board, they may do so. All right, if there's anything further from the applicant or staff,
I want to make sure, even if we all agreed it was premature or not, I think it's gotten a little convoluted between section 2 and section 3. So section 2, which we spent a lot of time on the zoning ordinance amendment on the last appeal, it also says zoning applications, which is things that come to the ZBA at times, right? So that's where I'm coming from, is a special use permit could be a change of use. And this was in the context of discussing that last amendment where it allowed for special use permits for that type of use. So 2 says zoning applications shall be considered, zoning applications affecting proposed or designated landmarks or historic districts. The HPC shall consider such applications and or amendments prior to the zoning board of adjustment. Again, I'm saying in 2, a change of use on its own would not necessarily affect an historic resource. And again, the words there are not great because designated landmarks are few and far between, and a district is also not exactly what you affect when you're doing a ZBA action. And then 3 is giving the permit authority to HPC, which is different than what 2 is saying. Right, so 3 is saying, again, fence is the best example. All across the city, you need no permit for a fence unless you're in the historic district. And HPC historic preservation code standards tell you how to do a fence. At this time, staff can approve those, not the HPC, but it's a good example of where the notwithstanding that other base zone uses. But it adds on, and we are 100% that list is all attached to parking. It's not about a change of use. It's about an area used for industrial, commercial, business, home industry, or occupational parking. It's not those other things. And that is where this all kind of came together. So again, there is no permit. It seems a little premature, but because of the conversations, and as David said, once I responded, he felt he had to respond. But I think if you take this up tonight and concur with me, then that is a decision of the ZBA. It is not going to be a planning director decision because you've confirmed that my decision process is appropriate and that a change of use on its own would not necessarily trigger these other reviews. Again, it can, but I don't have the specific permit in front of you to tell you that.
was that inquired to as a part of this, or would that just come out of this after the fact?
Well, if
I mean,
you're asking like if tonight you affirm my decision that a change of use does not necessarily require HPC review.
right.
I have not talked that through with the city attorney, but at that point, it's been decided by the ZBA to affirm the planning director's position. So why would you be able to appeal that again in the future? So I'm addressing what Mr. Carter said, that no matter what you do tonight, he would think he could appeal again when an actual permit comes in. I guess that's not something I was expecting to hear. So I kind of wanted to bring that up.
Well, the facts could be different though. So
Right. So again, a straight change of use with no other factors.
Right.
That's what's on the table tonight for discussion. And as I've said, if there are other aspects to it, it will get referred to HPC. It's not that it's preempted.
I have a question regarding the used for industrial, commercial, business, home industry, or occupational parking. industrial, commercial, business, and home industry, all of those are not official categories of use types in the chapter 29. So where would you put social services at?
It would not be on that list. And most of those or all of those are not actually use categories
Right.
in our code. It's a
So,
bad list from 2000.
so
So yeah, so
Parking-
social
parking.
service use.
parking's parking, but those uses. same
Yeah,
as
those types of
parking, all
uses.
those uses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what Julie's pointing out is in Article 5 of the zoning ordinance, everything is in a category of use. And there's a higher level title like trade uses, office uses, miscellaneous uses, institutional uses. And then there's more detailed lists under those. That list doesn't match any of those titles except for maybe industrial. In home industry or occupational, yeah. So it's a bad list because it doesn't match use categories, but social service provider is definitely not one of those by the way Article 5 is written.
I think there's lots of uses that aren't covered by that could have parking impacts in the district.
Right. And this gets really convoluted. So if you want to dig into the zoning ordinance more, like you might point out that apartments are not on this list. Apartments are going to have parking lots. Well, the single family conservation overlay addresses that. There's a major site plan process and it actually directs the review of an apartment project to HPC for review. So that's the most glaring absence of use on that list would be an apartment project. But these other uses are not even necessarily allowable within within the Old Town Historic District. There could be other historic districts where that is an issue.
So just to clarify, this, I think you said this, I just want you to say it again. This decision is to affirm your decision-making process regarding subsection 2.
Yes,
Okay.
it's in totality of both, but my position is a change of use within a structure that has no alterations to the structure does not require an HPC review.
Can we put that specific interpretation in our decision somehow?
Well, if we make,
I think if somebody
as far as
makes
the
that
motion, yeah.
Okay.
and it's
Can I borrow your pen? I'm gonna have to write that down.
because I think that brings clarity to the whole
Right.
issue of, and we can discuss that when the time comes.
May I speak on behalf
Rationale.
of the appellant?
Yeah, sure, because he has opportunity to provide a summary.
Thank you. Okay, so in addressing anything other than the aesthetic of the buildings within the Historic Preservation District with regards to this question, I think this is a slippery slope. I don't really see how this question is ripe for discussion at this time, but regardless, when addressing section 29, that also interweaves with chapter 31, the Historic Preservation Committee, that section 31 trumps any confusion with section 29. So I think that there are multiple things listed in that chapter in 31 that go outside of just the aesthetic, that require and say shall, that the HPC review those. So I think it's a very slippery slope to just generally say anything else can be bypassed by the HPC. So for that reason, I would just reiterate that, yes, I'll finish my thought. And then chapter 31 should trump 29. And if I may take a brief pause.
That's fine. Sure.
I think it would serve us all if I withdrew the appeal on this item.
Jane, what's procedure on that?
You haven't voted.
So
I don't-
anytime?
Yeah.
Kind of
I
civil.
don't think our rules specify.
It's his appeal, so
Yeah,
I think
it's
he has
his
the right
appeal.
to do that anytime before a final decision. Mr. Carter, is that what you wish to do? Pull out the rules here.
Dave,
Leave the appeal
Swi-
in place. Let's go
Can
ahead.
we take a second? Can I talk to Jane for a second before you make a final decision?
Okay.
Is that okay? If I consult with the,
Recess.
can we do a quick recess to kind of reframe this one? Because it's a little,
Yeah, I could probably take a recess and we'll take, let's give it till 1:45. I don't want to take too long.
like 5
So-
minutes is good.
8 minutes. We are adjourned. On the record, I guess. Hold on, we got to wait for. There we go. All right.
At that board
We'll
meeting.
call this meeting back to order, and I believe we were consider what the
Concluding.
consideration is for the withdrawal of the appeal or not.
Correct. We are moving forward with our appeal. And just in conclusion, I wanted to acknowledge that all parties seem to agree that this is not ripe to bring this action at this time, which I believe was reiterated on direct. And just in conclusion of my argument, that Chapter 31 controls here and that it expands beyond just construction issues. And I'd urge everyone to review that section in their consideration. Thank you. Any questions?
No, thank you. Mr. Digban, they've asserted that this issue is not ripe. What's your determination of that? Because if there is no actual decision before,
So what I wrote in my letter in November was to say because of Section 2 and the discussion about the amendments and all that, I went out and said, in response, a change of use in my interpretation would not affect an historic resource necessarily. And that was what triggered the response by David Carter to appeal that, because I had written that decision in November, and our local code has a 30-day window to an appeal a written determination by myself for that. So there has been no permit filed per se, but my interpretation would be that if a permit was filed and it was a use only, it did not necessarily have to go to HPC for consideration before the Zoning Board of Adjustment could look at it.
but there's no actual application that would apply currently, correct? I mean, there's nothing that would even right now to be considered to be sent before the HPC for whether there would be a
So there's no
certificate appropriate or not.
correct. There's nothing has been filed. It was about how, if something were to be filed, how would it be processed?
So, all right. All right.
And the way I'm just looking at it, and then David was very well aware of what we were talking about. So if you go into our municipal code, we have applications to the board section in Article 14. It then talks about appeals, and what it says is, I'm just going to read appeals to the board, just so you understand where we were coming from when this happened. A, general, appeals to the board may be taken by any person aggrieved by any decision of the zoning enforcement officer or by an officer, department, board, or bureau of the city affected by any decision of the zoning enforcement officer. Matters may be appealed to the board, include decisions by the plan on site plans. Then it says filing. This is the part where this is what triggered the appeal. So the next section says filing. A written notice of appeal must be filed with the secretary to the board within 30 days of a decision, order, or requirement by an administrative official. So that decision was not on a permit, but I said this is how I would interpret something.
Okay.
And David Carter then applied within 30 days to appeal that.
So I'm going to interpret that there's not been a decision made. It was an interpretation. So there's nothing before or to actually be considered. So I'm going to move that right now that this appeal be denied because it is not ripe. There is no decision that has been made. It was an interpretation because there's nothing before that there's no issue of whether or not the certificate of appropriateness has been applied at this time. So that's my motion. Do I have a second to that?
I'll second.
Second by White House.
I'll second.
Okay. Roll call vote.
Cruz? Nay.
McDaniel,
Aye.
Schneider,
Aye.
Patton,
Aye.
Whitehouse,
Aye.
Okay. The appeal has been denied based on the fact that it is not ripe. There is no decision that has been made by city staff regarding certificate of appropriateness and its applicability in this situation. So anyone wishing to appeal that decision may do so by filing writ of certiorari.
So just to be clear, the original language was about change of use, not just certificate of appropriateness. So I'm assuming by saying certificate of appropriateness, you also meant to include the use component.
No, I'm just
Discussion.
saying that that was what the issue was under section 29-1102, section 3 in the appeal. We're not making any determination about anything.
Okay.
So we're not about any of it because there's nothing before the board as far as any action that needs to be taken, whether it needs to be taken to the HBC or not. Nothing's happened. You were asked to interpret something. You did not make a decision. You were asked to interpret something and give an interpretation. So there's no decision that's been made. Since no decision was made, then there's nothing to appeal. The issue is not ripe.
You can appeal.
Just to clarify the record.
But there's interpretation of what? There's nothing that's there. There's nothing there. There has to be something, there has to be a controversy. There's no controversy.
Can I make a clarifying point?
No.
No, okay.
This time I will make a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, second by McDaniel. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you all.